The morning of July 18, 2013, rose quietly over Silver Peak National Park, the kind of deceptive calm that often precedes a long tragedy. Low clouds drifted lazily between the mountain ridges, thinning as the sun climbed higher, painting the forest canopy in muted shades of green and gold. For most visitors, it was just another summer day in Montana, warm, clear, and inviting. But for 19-year-old Emily Carter, it was the beginning of a journey that was never meant to end the way it did. Emily had always moved through the world with a careful confidence. She was not reckless, not impulsive. Raised in a small town outside Billings, she grew up learning the names of trees before she learned algebra, taught by a father who believed that nature rewarded respect and punished arrogance without warning. By the time she left for college, she had already hiked dozens of trails across the state, logging each route in a worn notebook she kept tucked inside her backpack. To her family, Emily was dependable to the point of predictability. That morning, she followed her routine precisely. At 6:42 a.m., a traffic camera on Route 89 captured her dark blue SUV heading north toward the eastern entrance of Silver Peak. She was alone. Inside the vehicle, the radio played softly, local news, then weather, then silence as the signal faded deeper into the mountains. Emily didn't notice. She was focused on the day ahead. Her destination was Half Moon Ridge Trail, an unofficial route known mostly to experienced hikers and park staff. It was not marked on most tourist maps, and that was exactly why she had chosen it. The ridge offered an unobstructed view of the valley below, especially around midday, when the sun reached its highest point. Emily had planned the hike meticulously, accounting for elevation gain, weather conditions, and daylight. She expected to be back at her car by early evening, at 8:03 a.m. A ranger station camera recorded Emily parking in a small gravel lot near the trailhead. She stepped out of the vehicle, stretching briefly before opening the trunk. Witnesses later described her movements as unhurried, deliberate. She checked her boots, adjusted the straps of her backpack, and took a final sip of water before locking the car. There was no sign of anxiety, no hesitation. Inside her backpack were 2 bottles of water, energy bars, a light windbreaker, a compact first aid kit, and a professional-grade camera she had saved for months to buy. Emily loved photography, particularly landscapes. She believed that images could preserve moments that words failed to hold. That day, she intended to capture the ridge under full sun. Before starting the ascent, Emily sent a brief message to her mother. "Heading up now." "Should be back before dark," her mother replied almost immediately. "Be careful. Call if you lose signal." Emily smiled, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and began walking. Half Moon Ridge was not a trail in the traditional sense. There were no signs, no railings, no clear path. The route relied on faint animal tracks, scattered cairns left by previous hikers, and an understanding of the landscape itself. Emily moved steadily, pausing occasionally to photograph the terrain or consult the small topographic map folded in her hand. By late morning, the forest had grown unnervingly quiet. At 11:56 a.m., Emily stopped near a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The wind was light, barely stirring the tall grass around her. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her mother. "It's incredibly quiet here, losing signal." The message sent at 11:58 a.m. It was the last confirmed communication Emily Carter would have with anyone outside the park for the next 9 years. Her mother replied less than a minute later, reminding her to turn back if the connection dropped completely. The message was never delivered. From a forensic standpoint, what happened next remains frustratingly unclear. No cameras covered Half Moon Ridge. No witnesses reported seeing Emily after she passed the tree line that morning. The trail itself offered countless places where a person could step off the intended route without realizing it, drawn by a better view or a clearer shot. What investigators do know is this: Emily did not return to her vehicle. By 6:30 p.m., the gravel lot near the trailhead remained unchanged. Her SUV sat exactly where she had parked it, untouched, its windows closed against the evening chill. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the lot, and the silence deepened. At home, Emily's parents began to worry. Emily was not the kind of person who ran late without explanation. She had promised to check in by evening, and she always kept her promises. At first they assumed poor reception, then they assumed a minor delay. By 8 p.m., concern had hardened into fear. At 8:27 p.m., Emily's father called the Silver Peak Ranger Station to report her overdue. The ranger on duty listened carefully, asking measured questions. What trail? What time did she start? What was she wearing? Had she experienced trouble on previous hikes? The ranger explained what protocol demanded, but families dread hearing. Night searches on Half Moon Ridge were dangerous. The terrain was unstable, visibility poor, and the area was known for predators. Any search would have to wait until first light. That night, Emily's parents did not sleep. When dawn broke on July 19th, the search began. By 5:30 a.m., helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept over the ridge, their rotors cutting through the still air. On the ground, ranger teams, search dogs, and volunteers moved carefully through the forest, calling Emily's name into the vast silence. Every footstep was documented. Every possible route was traced, but Half Moon Ridge resisted them. The wind shifted constantly, confusing the dogs and scattering scent trails. The rocky slopes bore no signs of a fall, no blood, no torn fabric. There were no footprints leading away from the ridge, no broken branches to suggest a struggle. It was as if Emily Carter had simply dissolved into the landscape. On the fourth day of the search, a volunteer descending into a narrow ravine nearly 2 miles off the planned route spotted something wedged between two stones. A small black object, partially obscured by dirt. It was a lens cap. Emily's father identified it immediately. There was a faint mark on the inside, a tiny scratch she had made herself after nearly losing it on a previous hike. The discovery electrified the search team and deepened the mystery at the same time. The ravine was not a place a casual hiker would enter without reason or equipment. Rangers rappelled into the gorge, scanning every inch of the rocky floor. They found nothing else. No camera, no backpack, no sign that Emily had fallen or been dragged. The trail ended there. After 3 weeks, resources were exhausted. Leads dried up. The official report concluded that Emily Carter likely suffered an accident in a remote area, her body concealed by natural factors beyond recovery. Her case file was closed. Her name was added to a list that no family ever wants to see, and the silence that followed stretched far beyond the mountains that had swallowed her. The first full day of searching began with an optimism that would later feel cruel in hindsight. At dawn on July 19th, Silver Peak National Park transformed from a place of quiet beauty into a coordinated grid of urgency. Radios crackled. Helicopter blades cut through the thin mountain air. Maps were spread across folding tables at a makeshift command post near the trailhead where Emily Carter's SUV still sat, untouched and accumulating dust. To experienced rangers, the presence of the vehicle was both reassuring and alarming. It meant Emily had not left the park voluntarily. It also meant she was still out there. Search and rescue teams were divided into sectors, each assigned a specific radius from the point where Emily was last seen. Ground crews moved slowly, methodically, trained to notice what ordinary hikers would overlook: a scuffed rock, a bent blade of grass, a footprint pressed into soft soil. Overhead, a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging swept the slopes, scanning for any trace of human body heat beneath the forest canopy. Nothing appeared. The dogs struggled first. Half Moon Ridge was an exposed area, and the wind shifted constantly throughout the day, lifting and scattering scent particles in unpredictable patterns. Handlers reported that the dogs circled repeatedly, confused, unable to establish a clear direction of travel. For those who had worked dozens of missing person cases, this was an unsettling sign. Even in the most difficult terrain, there was usually a direction: forward, downward, somewhere. Here there was nothing. By midday, the heat became oppressive. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, forming human chains to comb through the brush. Many of them were locals who knew the mountains intimately. Some had children Emily's age. Others had seen her photo on social media that morning and felt compelled to help. They searched ravines, rock ledges, and tree lines, calling her name until their voices turned hoarse. Emily. Emily Carter. The forest did not answer. From the perspective of investigators, the absence of evidence quickly became the most disturbing element of the case. There were no signs of a fall, no disturbed earth, no broken branches, no blood. There were no torn straps, no scraps of clothing caught on thorns. Even accidental disappearances usually left something behind: a dropped bottle, a misplaced shoe, a trail of panic. Emily left nothing. Her parents were kept at the command post, close enough to receive updates, far enough to stay out of danger. Emily's mother sat on a folding chair, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, refreshing the screen every few seconds as if willing a message to appear. Her father stood nearby, scanning the ridgeline with binoculars, even though he knew it was futile. On the second day, investigators expanded the search area beyond Half Moon Ridge, operating under the assumption that Emily may have wandered off course. The possibility of wildlife interaction was raised. Silver Peak was home to black bears, mountain lions, and a small but established population of grizzly bears. Experienced trackers examined the ground carefully, looking for drag marks or signs of a struggle. They found none. No blood, no fur, no indication of a predator encounter. By the third day, exhaustion set in. Volunteers rotated out, replaced by fresh faces who arrived with renewed hope and left with the same hollow expression. Some rangers began to quietly discuss scenarios they preferred not to voice aloud. A sudden medical emergency, a misstep into an unmarked crevice, a fall so severe that recovery would be impossible. Still, none of it explained the silence. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came on the fourth afternoon. A volunteer team descending into a narrow gorge nearly 2 miles east of Emily's intended route noticed a small black object lodged between two rocks. It was unremarkable at first glance, easily overlooked among the debris scattered by years of runoff. When the object was retrieved and cleaned, it revealed itself to be a camera lens cap. The mood at the command post shifted instantly. Emily's father recognized it before anyone else could speak. He pointed out the faint scratch on the inside, something Emily had mentioned casually months earlier after nearly losing it during another hike. For the search team, the discovery was both a confirmation and a complication. The lens cap proved Emily had been in that area. It also raised an unavoidable question. Why was she there? The gorge was steep, unstable, and far from any logical route a solo hiker would take without reason. Climbers were brought in to descend safely, searching every ledge and crevice below. They found nothing. No camera, no backpack, no body. The dogs, brought in again, behaved erratically near the gorge, whining and pacing but refusing to lead further. Handlers later described the behavior as agitation rather than detection, as if the scent simply vanished. After that, momentum began to fade. By the end of the second week, the search transitioned from aggressive rescue to cautious recovery. The tone of briefings shifted subtly, replacing words like when with if. Media coverage intensified briefly, then waned as no new information emerged. The public speculated wildly. Online forums filled with theories ranging from animal attacks to voluntary disappearance. Investigators dismissed the latter quickly. Emily Carter had left behind her car, her wallet, her phone, her future. On the 20th day, the decision was made to scale back operations. The terrain had been thoroughly searched. The resources required to continue at full capacity could no longer be justified without new leads. The official report cited an accident in a remote area, compounded by environmental factors that made recovery unlikely. Emily's case was moved to inactive status. For her parents, the word felt like a sentence. They returned home to a house that felt suddenly too large and impossibly quiet. Emily's room remained untouched. Her hiking boots still sat by the door. Her notebook, filled with trail names and handwritten observations, lay open on her desk, the last entry unfinished. The absence of a body created a peculiar kind of grief, one without punctuation. There was no funeral, no grave, no moment that allowed them to say goodbye. Friends offered condolences that felt premature. At least she loved the outdoors, some said, as if love could justify disappearance. Months passed. Then years. Silver Peak reclaimed its silence. New hikers walked Half Moon Ridge unaware of the name that still lingered in ranger archives. Emily Carter became one of many, another unresolved file, another photograph taped inside a drawer. What no one understood at the time was that the search had failed not because Emily was lost to the wilderness. It had failed because the wilderness was never the answer. The silence that followed the closure of Emily Carter's case was not sudden. It settled slowly, like dust after a collapse, coating everything her family touched. In the weeks after the search ended, life attempted to resume its ordinary rhythms, but every routine felt hollow. Every sound too loud or not loud enough. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit. Grief arrived without ceremony and refused to take shape. Emily's parents learned quickly that there was no vocabulary for this kind of loss. Friends spoke in careful fragments, unsure whether to offer hope or condolences. Some said she could still be out there. Others said nothing at all, their silence heavy with implication. Both responses hurt in different ways. Hope became a wound that never healed, reopening with every passing month. Emily's room remained untouched. Her mother could not bring herself to wash the clothes Emily had last worn at home. Her father avoided the garage, where camping gear hung neatly on hooks, exactly as Emily had left it. On the refrigerator door, her photograph stayed pinned in place long after the magnets lost their grip. The official letters arrived first. Park authorities sent notices expressing regret and appreciation for the family's cooperation. The Ranger Service closed the file formally, citing environmental concealment and lack of recoverable evidence. Insurance companies followed, cautious and impersonal, requesting documentation to establish presumed death. Each envelope forced the Carters to confront a reality they were not ready to accept. Emily's mother refused to sign anything that used the word deceased. For the first year, the family lived in a state of suspended motion. Emily's father continued to drive past the trailhead on weekends, parking briefly, scanning the trees as if she might emerge at any moment, older perhaps, changed, but alive. Emily's mother slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, convinced she heard footsteps on the porch or the faint click of a door opening. At night she imagined the phone ringing. The second year brought a different kind of pain. The world, indifferent and efficient, began to move on. Emily's disappearance faded from local news. New cases replaced hers in the public consciousness. Online forums that once dissected every detail grew quiet. The few who still discussed her fate did so in speculative tones detached from the human cost. Emily's parents were left alone with unanswered questions. From an investigative standpoint, there was nothing left to pursue. The lens cap remained the only physical evidence, sealed in an evidence bag, catalogued and stored. No DNA, no fingerprints, no leads. The wilderness explanation, while unsatisfying, was the only one that fit the absence of proof. Still, something about the case continued to trouble those who had worked it. A ranger who had been part of the initial search later admitted that Emily's disappearance stayed with him longer than most. He had seen hikers fall, wander, misjudge distances. Those cases left trails of error behind them. Emily's did not. There was a precision to the absence that felt unnatural, though he never voiced that thought officially. There was nothing he could substantiate. Years passed. Emily's younger cousin graduated high school, then college. Her parents aged visibly, the weight of unresolved loss carving lines into their faces. Holidays became exercises in endurance. Emily's place at the table remained empty, yet no one dared to fill it. In the 5th year, Emily's mother began volunteering with a local missing persons organization. It was not an act of acceptance, but of defiance. She refused to let Emily become a statistic. She attended vigils, distributed flyers, and spoke quietly with families who shared her particular brand of agony. Through them, she learned that unresolved disappearance carried its own pathology, an endless oscillation between hope and despair. Some nights, she dreamed Emily was calling out to her, her voice muffled, as if coming from underground. Emily's father responded differently. He retreated inward, focusing on tangible tasks that required little emotion. He repaired fences that did not need fixing. He cataloged old photographs, labeling dates and locations with clinical precision. In his private moments, he allowed himself a single, devastating thought. If Emily were alive, she would have found a way to come home. The 6th and 7th years brought subtle shifts. The Carters were advised, gently but persistently, to consider legal closure. Presumed death declarations would allow financial matters to settle. Estate paperwork could be completed. There were benefits to moving forward, they were told. Closure was framed as a kindness. They declined. Without proof, Emily was still alive to them. Somewhere, in the 8th year, something changed, not in the case file but in the way Emily's mother spoke about her daughter. She stopped using the present tense. It happened without conscious decision, slipping into her language as if her mind had accepted what her heart still resisted. The realization devastated her. She wept not for Emily's absence, but for the part of herself that had begun to believe the silence. The 9th year arrived quietly. By then, Silver Peak National Park had updated its trail maps. Half Moon Ridge was now listed more clearly, accompanied by warnings about unstable terrain and limited cell service. New signs stood where none had before. Hikers passed them without knowing why they existed. Emily Carter's name was no longer attached to the ridge. On a cold morning in October of 2022, nearly 9 years after Emily vanished, her mother sat alone in the kitchen, sipping coffee she had reheated twice without drinking. The radio played softly in the background. A story about early snowfall, road closures, Nothing unusual. She had learned not to expect miracles. What no one could have predicted was that the silence, so absolute, so consuming, was about to break. Not with a phone call from a ranger, not with a discovery in the mountains, but with a woman walking, unsteady and unrecognizable, into a small-town police station miles away, carrying a truth that would force everyone who had mourned Emily Carter to reconsider what they thought they understood about disappearance. For 9 years, the wilderness had been blamed. For 9 years, the wrong answer had gone unchallenged. On the afternoon of October 21, 2022, the town of Redwood Falls was preparing for winter. The streets were quiet, lined with one-story buildings and aging storefronts that served the same families year after year. The early cold had already driven most people indoors. Nothing about the day suggested that it would enter any official record. At 3:47 p.m., a security camera mounted above the entrance of the Redwood Falls Police Department captured a figure approaching from the sidewalk. At first glance, the woman looked homeless. Her posture was slightly hunched, her steps uneven, as if each one required conscious effort. She wore a faded men's jacket several sizes too large, its sleeves frayed and darkened with grime. Her jeans were stiff with dirt and oil stains, and her shoes, thin sneakers with worn soles, were completely inadequate for the cold creeping into the air. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, partially hidden beneath a hood pulled low. The camera struggled to capture her features clearly. She moved slowly, hesitating at the door, then forcing herself forward. Inside the station, the lobby was quiet. A desk officer looked up briefly, expecting a routine inquiry. The woman did not approach the counter immediately. She stood near the wall, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, scanning the room with quick, shallow movements of her head. Her eyes avoided faces. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried, "I need help." The words were hoarse, uneven, as if she had not used them often. Before the officer could ask her name, the woman's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor without a sound, her body folding inward as though surrendering to gravity. Panic rippled through the station. Paramedics were called immediately. By the time emergency services arrived, the woman was conscious but disoriented. Her pulse was weak, her blood pressure dangerously low. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, one of the responders noted how light she felt, far lighter than someone of her height should have been. She was transported to Redwood Falls Medical Center within minutes. In the emergency room, the initial assessment stunned the staff. The woman was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from chronic muscle atrophy. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over protruding bones. Old scars traced her arms, her back, her legs, some faint and faded, others newer, inflamed, poorly healed. When nurses cut away her clothing, they noticed something else. Around her wrists and ankles were pale, circular marks, symmetrical, deeply embedded into the skin. They were not injuries caused by a single event. They were the result of prolonged restraint. The attending physician ordered a full examination and contacted law enforcement immediately. When the woman regained full consciousness, her behavior shifted. She became guarded, then overtly fearful. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, curling inward, her eyes darting to the door every time it opened. She refused to give her name. When asked where she had come from, she shook her head violently. "They'll be angry," she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to be gone this long." The words were recorded in the intake report. Given her condition and the visible signs of long-term abuse, officers made the decision to attempt identification through fingerprinting, a standard procedure for unidentified patients in medical distress. A portable scanner was brought to her bedside. The woman did not resist. She simply stared at the wall as the process was completed, her lips moving silently as if reciting something to herself. The fingerprints were uploaded to the national database at 5:12 p.m. 43 minutes later, the system returned a result. The officer who received the notification read it twice, convinced there had been a mistake. The file was old, archived, marked with a status few ever expected to see reversed. Emily Carter. Missing since July 2013. Case status, inactive, presumed deceased. The officer stepped out of the room, his face drained of color. Within the hour, the hospital floor was quietly secured. Additional officers arrived. A detective from the county sheriff's department was dispatched immediately. The news traveled fast, carried not by sirens or headlines, but by urgent phone calls and tight voices. Emily Carter was alive, physically, barely, psychologically, fractured beyond immediate comprehension. The woman in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the smiling 19-year-old whose photograph still sat in her parents' home. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and dull. Her hands were calloused, her fingernails cracked and uneven. Her movements were small, controlled, as if she had learned that drawing attention carried consequences. The detective assigned to the case attempted a brief interview that evening. It lasted less than 10 minutes. Emily did not respond to her name. She rocked gently back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the floor. When the detective asked where she had been for the past 9 years, Emily whispered a single sentence. "I have to finish the list." No list was found on her person. Medical evaluations over the next 24 hours painted a devastating picture. Forensic specialists documented injuries consistent with years of captivity, restraint marks, repeated minor trauma, signs of malnutrition that could not be explained by homelessness alone. On her upper back, doctors identified several circular burn scars, uniform in size and shape. A forensic consultant noted quietly that they resembled cigarette lighter burns. Psychological assessments were equally grim. Emily displayed extreme hypervigilance, dissociation, and what clinicians described as learned submission. Every unexpected sound caused her to flinch. When staff raised their voices even slightly, her breathing would stop for several seconds at a time, her body rigid with fear. The conclusion was clear. Emily Carter had not survived 9 years in the wilderness. She had been held. On the 3rd day of her hospitalization, once her condition stabilized enough to allow limited contact, doctors approved a visit from her parents. The meeting took place under supervision, with medical staff ready to intervene if necessary. Emily's mother entered the room first. She crossed the space in seconds, tears streaming down her face, reaching for the daughter she had mourned for nearly a decade. What happened next shattered every expectation she had carried into that room. Emily recoiled. She pressed herself back against the bed, her eyes wide with terror. Instead of calling out to her mother, she began apologizing, rapidly, desperately, her voice breaking. "I didn't leave," she said. "I didn't run away. I fell. I was dizzy. Please tell them I didn't try to leave." She spoke as if someone else were listening, someone unseen but absolute. Her mother stood frozen, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. Detectives listening from behind the glass exchanged looks. Emily was not afraid of the people in the room. She was afraid of the consequences of being gone. Whatever had held her for 9 years, it still owned her fear. That night, as snow began to fall softly outside the hospital windows, investigators made a quiet decision. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was an active criminal investigation, and the truth, whatever it was not buried in the mountains. It was much closer than anyone had ever imagined. Over the next several days, Emily Carter's body became a document. Every bruise, every scar, every abnormality was photographed, measured, and cataloged with clinical precision. The medical staff worked methodically, aware that what they were recording would soon become evidence, testimony, and, inevitably, public record. The numbers alone told a story of prolonged deprivation. Emily's weight was dangerously low for her height. Blood tests revealed chronic anemia, electrolyte imbalance, and markers consistent with years of sustained malnutrition. Muscle wasting suggested long-term inactivity, not the kind associated with homelessness or transient living, but with confinement. More disturbing were the patterns on her skin. Forensic examiners noted the symmetry first. The pale rings around Emily's wrists and ankles were uniform in width and placement, a detail that eliminated the possibility of random injury. The skin beneath them was thickened and fibrotic, indicating prolonged pressure over many years. These were not restraints, used once or twice. They were restraints worn regularly, possibly daily. On her upper back and shoulders, doctors documented several circular burn scars, each nearly identical in diameter. The edges were sharply defined. Some were old, others newer, overlapping in a way that suggested repetition rather than accident. A forensic consultant later wrote in her report that the injuries were highly consistent with deliberate infliction using a heated metal object. No further speculation was needed. As the physical examination continued, another anomaly emerged, one that caused the attending physician to pause before speaking. Imaging scans revealed physiological changes that could not be explained by malnutrition or injury alone. A gynecological assessment confirmed what the medical team had already begun to suspect. Emily Carter had given birth at some point during the year she was missing. The finding was not immediately disclosed to law enforcement. Doctors debated the timing carefully, understanding the psychological fragility of the patient. But the information was added quietly to her chart, marked with a notation indicating the likelihood of childbirth several years prior. There was no infant with her when she arrived. When Emily was awake, her behavior remained consistent and deeply concerning. She rarely initiated speech. When she did, it was often in the form of apology or justification. Phrases disconnected from the present moment. She flinched at sudden movements. She avoided eye contact. At night, nurses reported that she slept in short bursts, waking abruptly with shallow gasps, her eyes scanning the room as if orienting herself to unseen threats. Every sound was processed as danger. Psychologists observing Emily through a one-way mirror noted classic indicators of severe captivity trauma: dissociation, learned helplessness, and hypercompliance. She responded to direct instructions instantly but appeared confused when asked to make choices. When given a menu, she froze. When asked if she was hungry, she nodded reflexively but did not eat until explicitly told it was allowed. One nurse later testified that Emily asked permission before using the restroom. Law enforcement began reconstructing Emily's movements on the day she collapsed at the police station. Surveillance footage from Redwood Falls revealed that she had arrived on foot. She had not used public transportation. She had not been dropped off by a vehicle. Her route, pieced together frame by frame, showed her entering town from the southeastern outskirts, an area of quiet residential streets and small commercial properties. Detectives took note of her gait. Despite her physical weakness, her movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if following an internal map. She did not wander. She did not hesitate at intersections. She walked as someone who knew exactly where she was going. In one piece of footage, captured outside a closed hardware store, Emily stopped briefly and looked down at her hands. In her right palm was a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it carefully, checked it, then continued walking. When officers inventoried Emily's belongings at the hospital, they found the paper. It was a shopping list. The handwriting was uneven. The letters slanted downward as if written under strain. Items were listed simply: bleach, sponges, canned food. Nothing unusual. What drew attention was the back of the paper. Faint but still visible beneath smudges of dirt and grease was part of a logo and a fragment of text. Forensic imaging specialists enhanced the scan. The words became legible. Northline Auto Service. The list had not been written on fresh paper. It had been torn from an older document, possibly an invoice or promotional flyer from a local business. Detectives cross-referenced the name. Northline Auto Service was a small repair shop located less than 2 miles from the route Emily had taken into town. The discovery shifted the investigation sharply inward. Meanwhile, Emily remained largely unresponsive to direct questioning. When detectives attempted to ask about the list, she became visibly distressed. Her breathing accelerated. She curled into herself, repeating a single phrase. "I was late." Late for what, she would not say. The question of the child, unspoken but looming, began to haunt the medical staff. Pediatric specialists reviewed Emily's records, estimating timelines. The evidence suggested the child would be several years old now. Old enough to walk. Old enough to speak. Old enough to remember. When Emily was gently asked if there was anyone else who needed help, her response was immediate and clear. "She's safe," Emily whispered. "She has to be." It was the longest, most coherent sentence she had spoken since her arrival. Doctors noted the change carefully. Investigators, now certain they were dealing with an ongoing criminal threat, accelerated their work. They canvassed neighborhoods near Northline Auto Service, reviewing property records and recent service calls. One address stood out, an unassuming single-story house less than 1.5 miles from the police station. The homeowners were a married couple. No criminal records, no prior complaints. Quiet, according to neighbors. Religious, according to one. Reclusive, according to another. Perfectly ordinary. Back at the hospital, Emily's parents struggled to reconcile the daughter they remembered with the woman in the bed. Emily's mother sat by her side for hours, speaking softly about mundane things: weather, family updates, memories Emily might recognize. Sometimes Emily listened. Sometimes her eyes glazed over, retreating to a place no one else could follow. At one point, Emily's mother noticed something that stopped her cold. Emily was humming. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A lullaby Emily's mother had sung to her as a child. The realization struck with devastating clarity. Emily had not been alone during her captivity. That night, detectives gathered in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU. Evidence photographs were spread across the table. Medical reports lay open. The shopping list sat in an evidence bag at the center. This was no longer a story about a young woman lost to the wilderness. It was a story about prolonged captivity hidden in plain sight. And somewhere, possibly within walking distance of the hospital, there was a place where Emily Carter had spent nearly 9 years of her life, and where a child had learned to exist in silence. The investigators understood the urgency. Whatever had broken Emily free had also broken the rules that had kept her captive. If they did not move quickly, the consequences would not be limited to the past. The investigation moved forward quietly, deliberately, with none of the urgency that would later define it. Detectives understood that haste at this stage could be fatal. Whatever system had held Emily Carter for nearly 9 years had relied on routine, invisibility, and the assumption that no one was looking in the right place. Now, someone was. The first task was to reconstruct Emily's final hours before she collapsed at the police station. Surveillance footage from Redwood Falls was reviewed in sequence, not just from public cameras but from private businesses, traffic intersections, and residential doorbells. Analysts worked through the night, marking timestamps, plotting movements, building a timeline that gradually took shape. Emily entered the town limits at approximately 2:58 p.m. She came on foot, emerging from the southeastern edge of Redwood Falls, an area characterized by low traffic, modest homes, and small service businesses. The footage showed her walking along the shoulder of the road, head down, her hood pulled tight around her face. She did not stop to rest. She did not look around. Her pace was slow but unwavering. To seasoned investigators, it looked less like wandering and more like compliance. At 3:12 p.m., one camera captured Emily hesitating for the first time. She stood at a street corner for nearly 10 seconds, glancing down at the folded paper in her hand. She adjusted her grip on it, smoothed it flat against her palm, then turned left. That turn would become critical. Detectives overlaid the route onto a map of the town. The path led past a closed laundromat, a vacant lot, and finally toward a cluster of small businesses, including Northline Auto Service. Emily did not enter the shop. She passed it without slowing, continuing down the street as if the building itself were merely a landmark, not a destination. The list, investigators concluded, was not meant for that location. It was meant to remind her where she came from. Detectives visited Northline Auto Service the following morning. The owner, a man in his early 50s with grease-stained hands and an unremarkable demeanor, cooperated fully. He confirmed that the paper matched an old invoice format the shop had used years earlier before switching systems. Hundreds of copies had been printed and distributed as promotional flyers or handed out with receipts. When asked if he recognized Emily Carter, the man shook his head. But when detectives asked for customer records dating back nearly a decade, his expression changed. The records were incomplete, some archived, some lost. Still, one address appeared repeatedly over the years. A residential customer who serviced an aging vehicle with unusual regularity, often paying in cash. The address was less than 2 miles from the police station, a single-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The name on the records belonged to a couple, Daniel and Laura Whitmore. A background check revealed nothing overtly alarming. No criminal history, no restraining orders, no prior investigations. Daniel worked intermittently in construction and maintenance. Laura was listed as unemployed, occasionally volunteering with local church groups. They owned their home outright, paid taxes on time. They were, by every measurable standard, unremarkable. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood discreetly, posing as officers following up on a minor incident. Neighbors described the Whitmores as quiet, polite, and private. They kept to themselves, no loud parties, no frequent visitors. When asked if they had children, most neighbors shrugged. One elderly woman across the street hesitated before answering. "There was a girl," she said slowly. "Or maybe a young woman. She'd be outside sometimes, early mornings, late evenings, never spoke, always looking down." The woman assumed she was a relative or a live-in helper, someone down on her luck. It wasn't unusual, she explained, for people to take in family members quietly, especially religious people. Another neighbor recalled hearing a child cry once or twice years earlier but dismissed it. Children cry, houses echo. Nothing about the Whitmore residence raised alarms. That in itself was the most troubling detail. While detectives worked the neighborhood, a parallel team focused on the child. Hospital staff coordinated with social services, cross-referencing missing child reports, school records, and welfare checks. No child matching the estimated age appeared in any database. The implication was stark. The child had never been registered. No birth certificate, no school enrollment, no medical records. She had existed entirely outside the system. When Emily was shown a still image from one of the surveillance cameras, her own figure walking toward town, she reacted in a way that startled the clinicians. She did not focus on herself. Her gaze went immediately to the edge of the frame. "She went first," Emily whispered. Doctors paused the interview. Later, under controlled conditions, Emily was asked if the child had been with her that day. She nodded once. "She knows where to wait," Emily said. "She's good at being quiet." The statement chilled everyone in the room. Investigators returned to the footage with new eyes. On a residential camera located 3 blocks from the police station, they noticed something they had missed before. A few minutes before Emily entered the frame, a smaller figure passed by the same camera. A child. She was walking quickly, head down, wearing an oversized jacket that nearly swallowed her frame. Her hair was tied back tightly. She did not look toward the camera. She disappeared down a side street, time-stamped at 3:34 p.m. Emily entered the police station 13 minutes later. The conclusion was unavoidable. Emily had not come to the station to escape. She had come to create a distraction. A welfare check was initiated quietly, without sirens or marked vehicles. Social workers accompanied officers to the address Emily's route suggested, a modest home belonging to an older woman known in the community for taking in people temporarily. The door was answered calmly. The woman appeared confused, but cooperative. Inside the house, officers found the child. She was sitting on the floor, drawing with colored pencils. She did not look up when strangers entered the room. When asked her name, she hesitated, then whispered it so softly it was barely audible. She appeared healthy, though underweight, clean, no visible injuries. When asked who brought her there, she answered simply, "My mother." The child was taken into protective custody immediately. Back at the hospital, when Emily was told the child was safe, something inside her finally gave way. Her shoulders slumped, her breathing slowed. For the first time since her arrival, she cried, not violently, not loudly, but with the silent release of someone who had been holding themselves together by sheer will. The final piece fell into place that evening. Detectives obtained a warrant for the Whitmore residence. They approached the house just before dawn, under the cover of darkness, hoping to preserve whatever evidence remained. As officers positioned themselves around the property, one detail became immediately apparent. The house was too quiet. No lights, no movement, no signs of life. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal. Clean floors, neutral decor, family photographs on the walls, a refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. But one officer noticed something odd: deep scratches in the linoleum near the refrigerator, as if it had been dragged repeatedly. When the appliance was pulled away from the wall, it revealed a narrow door disguised as part of the cabinetry. There was no handle on the outside, only a lock, and behind it a steep set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. At that moment, the investigation crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer about finding answers. It was about confronting a place that had been designed to erase a human being and teach a child to survive in silence. The entry team moved with practiced restraint. There was no dramatic breach, no shouted commands. The warrant had been obtained hours earlier, and the Whitmore residence had offered no resistance, not because its occupants were compliant, but because they were absent. Daniel and Laura Whitmore were taken into custody later that morning at a roadside motel less than 20 miles away. At the house, the focus belonged entirely to what lay beneath it. When the lock behind the refrigerator was disengaged, the sound echoed unnaturally through the kitchen. The hidden door opened inward, releasing a stagnant breath of air that carried with it a mixture of dampness, mold, and chemical cleanser. It was a smell that experienced officers recognized immediately, though few ever hoped to encounter again. A narrow staircase descended steeply into darkness. The steps were worn smooth in the center, their edges dulled by years of use. Tactical lights swept downward as the first officers descended, careful to document every inch. The walls were close, deliberately narrow, forcing anyone using the stairs to keep their shoulders turned inward. It was a design choice, not a limitation of space. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a single room. There were no windows. The walls were lined with soundproofing panels, professionally installed and sealed with precision. The ceiling was low. The air felt heavy, compressed, as if the room itself resisted the presence of outsiders. A single bare bulb hung from the center, controlled by a switch near the stairs. When the light was turned on, the room revealed itself slowly, detail by detail. In the center of the concrete floor lay a thin mattress, stained and compressed into a permanent indentation. The bedding was threadbare, washed so many times it had lost its original color. Near one corner stood a plastic bucket with a fitted lid. Along the wall, several empty water bottles were lined neatly, their labels peeled away. The most immediate and undeniable object in the room was embedded directly into the floor, a thick metal ring, anchored into the concrete with industrial bolts. Attached to it was a length of heavy chain. The chain showed clear signs of prolonged use. The links were polished smooth in places, worn down by constant friction. At the end hung a set of open shackles, their inner surfaces dulled by skin contact over many years. The length of the chain had been measured with intent. It allowed movement between the mattress and the bucket, no further. Forensic specialists photographed the ring from multiple angles before anyone spoke. On the walls, at eye level for someone seated on the mattress, sheets of paper had been taped carefully in place. They were yellowed with age, edges curling slightly, but the ink remained legible. Speak only when spoken to. Eyes down. Gratitude for food is mandatory. Noise will be punished. There were no signatures, no dates, no explanation. To investigators, the rules were not merely instructions. They were a system, a framework designed to dismantle autonomy piece by piece. The room was not chaotic. It was controlled. In one corner, something unexpected shifted the tone of the search. A small stack of children's books. They were old donated paperbacks, their covers creased and faded. Inside, some of the pages had been colored in with uneven strokes. Crayons lay nearby, worn down to nubs. The drawings were frantic, at first. Dark, heavy lines pressed hard into the paper, but grew lighter toward the back of the books. A child had been here. Near the mattress, forensic technicians found a low wooden stool. Its legs bore scratch marks where it had been dragged repeatedly across the floor. The surface was worn smooth. Along one edge, faint bite marks were visible, small, consistent with a child's teeth. The implications settled heavily over the room. Above the soundproofing, technicians discovered an improvised ventilation system, small, cleverly concealed ducts that allowed air to circulate without carrying sound upward. Whoever designed the space understood acoustics, understood how screams traveled, understood how to stop them. Back upstairs, the house maintained its illusion of normalcy. Family photographs lined the hallway, Daniel and Laura smiling stiffly in front of landmarks, church events, holiday decorations. In one photograph, a younger version of the couple stood beside a Christmas tree. At the edge of the frame, partially cropped, a small figure was visible. A child's arm. Investigators searched the kitchen thoroughly. In a high cabinet, out of reach of the average adult without a stool, they found a sealed plastic container. Inside were folded clothes, small, carefully preserved. Dresses, socks, a tiny jacket, and beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper, a faded blue backpack. Emily Carter's. The backpack contained items cataloged years earlier as missing: her camera strap, a broken lens hood, the same model lens cap found in the gorge near Half Moon Ridge. They had been kept not as evidence but as trophies. The final discovery came from a locked drawer in the bedroom. Inside lay a folder labeled simply, "Renovation." The documents inside were dated months before Emily's disappearance. They included architectural sketches of the basement, load calculations for concrete reinforcement, soundproofing specifications, and handwritten notes detailing material costs. Bank records later confirmed purchases of industrial insulation panels, reinforced hinges, and heavy-gauge chain. The room had been prepared. Emily had not been taken opportunistically. She had been selected. When Daniel and Laura Whitmore were questioned separately later that day, both attempted variations of the same narrative. They claimed they had found Emily disoriented in the woods years earlier and offered her shelter out of compassion. They insisted she refused to leave, that the child was born of a consensual relationship, that the basement was a safe space. The evidence rendered every word meaningless. The chain marks on the floor aligned precisely with the scars on Emily's body. The rules on the wall matched her conditioned behavior in the hospital. The ventilation system explained how a human being could disappear within walking distance of neighbors without a single scream being heard. The house had functioned as a blind spot. That evening, as the evidence was logged and the room was sealed, one detective remained behind for a moment longer. He stood at the base of the stairs, looking back into the space that had contained nearly a decade of someone's life. On the wall, beneath the posted rules, a small mark caught his attention: a child's height, scratched lightly into the soundproofing. It was not a measurement. There were no numbers, just a line. Proof that time had passed, even here. The officers turned off the light and sealed the door. Upstairs, the refrigerator was pushed back into place. The kitchen returned to its appearance of domestic normalcy, concealing the opening once more, though it would never hide anything again. The basement had been found. But for Emily Carter and her daughter, the question that remained was far more complex. How do you leave a place that has taught you the rules of survival from the moment you wake up? And how do you teach a child that silence is no longer necessary? What emerged over the following weeks was not a single confession, but a reconstruction, assembled piece by piece from interrogations, forensic data, recovered documents, and the fractured testimony of a woman whose mind still lived under rules written on a basement wall. Daniel Whitmore spoke first. In the interrogation room, he did not raise his voice. He did not deny the existence of the basement or the chain. Instead, he framed his words carefully, as if explaining a project that had gone wrong rather than a crime that had consumed nearly a decade of someone's life. He described himself as methodical, misunderstood, unfairly judged by people who did not understand control. He admitted that Emily Carter was not targeted personally. She was selected. Whitmore explained that he and his wife had been searching for the right conditions for years, a young woman traveling alone, physically healthy, no immediate social anchors nearby, someone whose disappearance could be plausibly attributed to the environment. National parks, he explained calmly, provided a perfect narrative. Accidents were expected there. Bodies were not always found. Emily's hike on Half Moon Ridge had been monitored before she ever stepped onto the trail. Recovered phone records and credit card data placed the Whitmore's vehicle at a gas station less than 40 miles from Silver Peak on the morning of July 18, 2013. Surveillance footage showed Laura Whitmore exiting the store moments after Emily, her gaze lingering just long enough to register the absence of companions. That was all they needed to see. Daniel described the plan without emotion. Laura would approach first, pretending to be injured, a twisted ankle, a fall, something small enough to trigger empathy. Daniel waited out of sight, carrying a high-voltage stun device purchased months earlier and tested repeatedly. Emily did what most people would have done. She stopped to help. The attack itself lasted seconds. There was no prolonged struggle, no screaming. The stun device incapacitated her almost instantly. Daniel and Laura moved quickly, securing her and transporting her away from the trail under the cover of terrain that blocked any clear line of sight. By the time search teams mobilized the following morning, Emily was already in the basement. The disappearance had been engineered to look accidental from the first moment. Laura Whitmore's testimony, offered later under the guidance of counsel, filled in details Daniel omitted. Where Daniel spoke of systems and planning, Laura spoke of roles. She described herself not as a victim of coercion, but as an equal participant, someone who enforced rules, administered punishments, and maintained routine. It was Laura who created the rules posted on the wall. It was Laura who decided when silence was required, when food was withheld, when compliance was rewarded with brief moments of reduced restraint. She described the process as training, a word that appeared repeatedly in her recovered personal notes. Emily's resistance during the early months had been anticipated. Laura described those months as the hardest, not because of guilt, but because breaking will took time. Emily screamed until her voice failed. She cried until dehydration forced compliance. When those methods ceased to be effective, the punishments became quieter, more psychological. Uncertainty replaced pain. Emily never knew when someone would descend the stairs, never knew whether silence would be rewarded or punished. Over time, her behavior shifted. Her movements became smaller. Her voice disappeared. She learned that obedience reduced suffering. The birth of the child complicated everything. Medical evidence confirmed that Emily became pregnant several years into her captivity. Laura described the pregnancy not as an accident, but as an unplanned outcome that required adjustment to their system. Emily was kept alive during childbirth not out of compassion, but necessity. The child, a girl, was born in the basement. No hospital, no records, no witnesses beyond her captors. Laura admitted that for a time she considered the child a liability, a variable they had not accounted for. But as the years passed, the child became integrated into the system. She was taught the rules early, taught when to speak, when to remain silent, when to look down. The rule about noise had been written for her. Emily's compliance changed after the child was born. For the first time since her capture, she began to endure not just to survive, but to protect. The investigators reviewing Laura's notes noticed a shift in language around this period. References to defiance decreased. References to management increased. Emily was no longer trying to escape. She was trying to keep her daughter alive. Daniel Whitmore described this shift with irritation. He claimed Emily had become useful, more predictable. She followed instructions without hesitation. She completed tasks when allowed upstairs. She accepted the narrative she was given, that any attempt to leave would result in consequences not for her, but for her child. The lie was effective. Emily was told that her parents had moved on, that she had been declared dead, that no one was looking for her anymore. Daniel reinforced this belief with details gathered from the internet. Photographs of her parents' home, taken from public records and online postings, presented as proof of ongoing surveillance. If she tried to run, he told her, they would be punished. The turning point came years later, not with an act of rebellion but with a question. According to Emily's fragmented testimony, her daughter asked why the light upstairs was different from the light below, why the air outside smelled different, why voices existed beyond the walls. Emily realized then that the system that had contained her was beginning to fail. Children grow, they ask questions, they notice inconsistencies. Emily began planning quietly, over months, not days. She memorized routines, noted when Laura left the house, noted which neighbors were home during which hours. She learned which stores were within walking distance, and how long it took to reach them. When the opportunity finally came, it did not look like an escape. Laura was ill, Daniel was at work. Emily was given permission to leave the house briefly to purchase supplies. She was given a list, she was told where to go, she was warned not to speak to anyone. Emily followed every instruction. She left the house with her daughter. But instead of returning, she deviated at the last possible moment. She brought the child to safety first, leaving her with someone Emily believed would not ask questions immediately. Only then did she continue on alone, to the police station. Not to escape, but to draw attention. Emily did not collapse by accident. Her body failed after completing its final task. In the interrogation room, when confronted with the evidence, Daniel Whitmore showed no remorse. He referred to the basement as a controlled environment. He insisted that Emily would not have survived without them, that the child owed her existence to their decisions. Laura, by contrast, said very little. When she did speak, it was to minimize her role or shift responsibility. She avoided discussing the child altogether. The truth, as reconstructed by investigators, was far simpler and far more disturbing. This was not an act of desperation. It was not a crime of opportunity. It was a long-term project designed to erase a person, replace autonomy with obedience, and prove that a human being could be reduced to a set of rules and still function. Emily Carter had survived it. But survival, the investigation made clear, was not the same as freedom. The trial of Daniel and Laura Whitmore began in the spring of 2024, nearly 11 years after Emily Carter had stepped onto Half Moon Ridge and vanished from public memory. By then, the case had already become a national fixation. Courtroom sketches circulated online within minutes. Commentators debated not only the crime but how it had been allowed to exist unnoticed for so long, hidden behind a refrigerator in an ordinary home. The courtroom itself was deliberately restrained. No cameras were permitted, no dramatics were allowed. The judge made it clear from the outset that this would not be a spectacle. Yet the gravity of what had occurred filled the room regardless. Emily did not attend the first week of testimony. Doctors advised against it. Her presence, they warned, could undo months of fragile progress. Instead, she remained in a secure residential treatment facility with her daughter, monitored closely, shielded from coverage, her location kept confidential. Her absence from the courtroom did not lessen her presence in the proceedings. Every piece of evidence pointed back to her body, her voice, her years of forced silence. The prosecution's case was methodical, almost clinical. They began not with emotion but with structure. Architectural diagrams of the basement were displayed on screens, enlarged to show measurements, materials, and the deliberate constraints imposed on movement. Forensic experts testified to the soundproofing, the ventilation system, the anchoring of the metal ring into reinforced concrete. This was not a makeshift space, it was engineered. Medical professionals followed. They spoke in careful terms about Emily's injuries, the restraint marks, the burn scars, the long-term effects of captivity on the human nervous system. A psychologist explained learned submission, describing how prolonged control rewires behavior until obedience becomes reflex rather than choice. When the topic of the child was introduced, the courtroom shifted. The prosecution avoided names. The girl was referred to only as the minor. Her existence was established through medical timelines, developmental assessments, and recovered items from the basement, books, drawings, clothing. The implication was unmistakable without being spoken aloud. A child had spent her earliest years learning that silence was safety. Daniel Whitmore's defense centered on distortion rather than denial. His attorneys argued that Emily had been unstable, that she had chosen to stay, that the basement was a misguided attempt at protection. They suggested that consent had existed at various points, carefully phrasing their language to blur responsibility. The jury listened. Then the prosecution played recorded excerpts from Daniel's own interrogation. His voice filled the courtroom, flat, precise, detached, as he described control, systems, and predictability. There was no anger in his tone, no fear, no remorse. Only the calm explanation of someone describing a process that had functioned exactly as intended until it failed. The defense abandoned its narrative shortly after. Laura Whitmore's testimony came next, and with it, a fracture in the united front. As part of a plea agreement, she agreed to testify fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. She entered the courtroom subdued, avoiding eye contact, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She described the rules, she described enforcement, she described punishments in vague, non-physical terms, but the implications were clear. When pressed about the child, Laura's voice faltered for the first time. She insisted she had kept the child safe, that she had done her best. The prosecutor asked one question: safe from what? Laura did not answer. The most powerful testimony came without Emily ever taking the stand. A recording of her initial hospital interview was played, edited carefully, stripped of identifying details. In it, Emily apologized repeatedly for being late. She explained herself to someone who was not there. She asked permission to speak. The jury sat in silence. Several jurors wept. After 6 weeks of testimony, deliberations began. They lasted less than 2 days. Daniel Whitmore was found guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, aggravated assault, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple charges related to abuse and endangerment. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Laura Whitmore was found guilty on lesser but still severe charges. In accordance with her plea agreement, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with eligibility for review after serving the full term. The decision sparked public outrage. To Emily's family, it felt like a compromise carved out of necessity rather than justice. Emily's parents attended the sentencing. They sat together in the back row, holding hands. When the verdict was read, they did not celebrate. There was no sense of relief, only exhaustion. The courtroom could declare an end to the legal process, but it could not restore what had been taken. After the trial, attention shifted briefly to Emily and her daughter. Journalists speculated about their future, about recovery, about resilience. Most of those questions went unanswered. What little was confirmed came from medical professionals. Emily was safe. Her daughter was safe. Recovery would be long. The real aftermath unfolded far from courtrooms and headlines. In the months that followed, Emily struggled with the simplest aspects of autonomy. She startled at sudden noises. She avoided closed doors. She refused to sleep in a bed elevated off the ground, choosing instead to rest on a mattress placed directly on the floor. She did not use metal utensils. When she needed food, she asked permission. Her daughter, meanwhile, adjusted in ways that were both hopeful and heartbreaking. She spoke freely now, but only in certain rooms. She slept with the lights on. She flinched when adults raised their voices, even in laughter. The rules of the basement had not been erased. They had been internalized. Emily worked with therapists daily, learning to make choices without fear of punishment, learning that silence was no longer required, learning that the world did not operate on a list taped to a wall. Progress came in fragments. One afternoon, Emily opened the refrigerator without hesitation. Another day, she spoke first. Each moment was small, each one was monumental. The court had delivered a verdict, but the true consequences of what had been done could not be measured in years or sentences. They would unfold slowly, quietly, in the space between mother and child, as they learned, together, how to exist without chains. Freedom arrived quietly for Emily Carter. There was no single moment that marked its beginning. No door opening in slow motion, no triumphant return to a life left behind. Instead, freedom came in fragments, small permissions granted one by one, each carrying the weight of fear rather than relief. Emily and her daughter lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a town whose name was never released to the public. The address was protected. The neighbors were told very little. To them, Emily was simply a woman recovering from something difficult. Her daughter was a quiet child who stayed close, always within arm's reach. Inside the house, there were no locks on the doors. That was intentional. And yet, every night, Emily checked them anyway. She did it without thinking, moving through the dark with careful steps, touching each handle lightly as if confirming not that it was secure, but that it existed. Sometimes she stood there longer than necessary, listening to the silence, waiting for a sound that never came. Her daughter slept in a room down the hall, the door always open. A nightlight cast a soft glow across the floor, illuminating drawings taped to the wall, houses with windows, trees with exaggerated branches, a sun that appeared in nearly every picture. Therapists said this was progress. The child was drawing what she had once been denied: light. During the day, Emily practiced ordinary choices: what to eat, when to rest, whether to go outside. Each decision required effort, as if the muscles responsible for autonomy had weakened from years of disuse. Sometimes she stood in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at the refrigerator, waiting for a voice to tell her it was allowed. No voice came. Her daughter noticed these pauses. She had learned to wait too. They attended therapy together. Emily spoke little at first, letting professionals describe her condition in language that felt distant and unreal. Post-traumatic stress, complex captivity trauma, long-term psychological conditioning, words that tried to explain a life lived under rules designed to erase choice. What the reports could not capture were the smaller moments. Emily flinching when a door closed too loudly. Her daughter lowering her voice instinctively when speaking indoors. Both of them freezing when a stranger knocked unexpectedly. The past did not announce itself. It surfaced in reflex. Emily's parents visited when permitted. The reunions were gentle, careful, as if everyone were learning a new language together. Emily's mother tried not to cry too often. Emily's father tried not to apologize for things he had never done. They spoke about weather, about the garden, about trivial details that felt safer than memory. Sometimes Emily watched them closely, as if studying how people were supposed to exist freely. At night, when the house settled into stillness, Emily lay awake on the mattress placed directly on the floor. She could sleep in a bed now. Doctors encouraged it, but the floor felt closer to something she understood. Her daughter often padded quietly into the room and curled up beside her. They slept like that, two bodies close together, not out of fear but habit. One evening, months after the trial had ended and public interest had moved on, Emily sat at the kitchen table while her daughter colored nearby. Outside, the sky darkened slowly, the kind of gradual shift that once marked danger. Emily watched it without panic. Her daughter looked up suddenly and asked a question she had never asked before. "Are we staying here forever?" Emily did not answer immediately. Forever was a concept she did not trust. "I don't know," she said finally. The child considered this, then returned to her drawing. She added a door to the house she was coloring. Then another. All of them open. Emily noticed later that night, after her daughter had fallen asleep, Emily stood in the doorway of her room and looked down the hall. The lights were off. The house was quiet. Nothing demanded her attention. For the first time in years, there was no list to complete, no time limit, no punishment waiting. Emily sat down on the floor and stayed there, breathing slowly, letting the silence exist without interpreting it as threat. She did not feel safe, not exactly, but she felt something unfamiliar and fragile beginning to take shape, uncertainty without terror. In the weeks that followed, Emily began walking outside alone, just short distances at first, to the end of the driveway, around the block. She memorized the route instinctively, as she always had, but now the knowledge served a different purpose. Not escape, orientation. On one of those walks, she passed a small park where children played loudly, their voices rising without consequence. Emily stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, watching. Her daughter tugged gently at her hand. "They're not in trouble," the child said softly, as if reassuring them both. Emily nodded. Somewhere, far away, the house on the quiet cul-de-sac still stood. The basement had been sealed, the refrigerator removed, the space rendered unusable, condemned. On official records, the location was now defined by what had been discovered there, but the rules written on those walls had not vanished so easily. They lingered in habits, in silence, in pauses between decisions. Emily Carter had been found. Her daughter had been saved. Justice, as defined by the court, had been served. And yet the story did not end cleanly, because survival does not erase captivity, and freedom does not arrive all at once. For Emily and her daughter, the future remained unwritten, open, uncertain, and entirely theirs for the first time. Not a happy ending, but a beginning.